We heard from neighbors that there was always a lot of yelling. She would often appear with bruises and discoloration.
He possibly had a shotgun. I didn't know who it was. And we started a verbal command, show us your hands, show us your hands.
It's like she almost seeked out those dangerous situations.
I knew he was hiding something. I just didn't know what.
The brain was absent. Their face was gone. There was no ability to look at this person and to determine who they were.
I mean, how do you even start to figure that out?
In this case, no science, no case.
Jamestown is a very small mountain community. It's about 15 miles northwest of the city of Boulder.
It's kind of an eclectic mix of people, the free spirit kind of folks. But we don't really get a lot of crime.
The peaceful veneer of this mountain town is stripped one Saturday morning when a resident makes a desperate call.
911, what's the emergency?
Okay. Me and her daughter just walked over here. She's on the couch, and she's got blood all over her face and everything, and I can't get her to wake up, and I can't still pulse. And she's cold, real cold.
A neighbor, Richard Astron, called in, unresponsive female, and she was on the couch. He described her as being cold at the touch, no pulse, and he described a strong odor or smell about her.
How old is her daughter?
Her daughter's 12.
And she's the one that's there with you?
Yes, yes.
I am her daughter.
What's your name?
My name is Laura.
Okay, Laura, I'm going to stay right with you until they get there, okay?
Okay.
The 911 call taker tried to get him to do CPR, and he said, no, she's dead.
Detectives Steve Ainsworth and Mark Spurgeon arrive at the scene.
I've been with the sheriff's office for 18 years and the last 8 years in major crimes. There's a lot of patience that goes into it, but there's also a lot of adrenaline that comes with it.
For me, the most satisfying part is helping somebody through an absolute horrible part of their life.
The detectives join EMS in a garage that has been converted to an artist's studio.
It's a smaller room, I would say probably 15 by 20 feet.
There's beer bottles all over, which really isn't unusual. But the thing that I really remember is it looks like it's completely ransacked. There's been some kind of a fight. I mean, it looks like a very potentially violent crime scene. You open the doors, and she's lying on her back on the floor, and she's covered partly up with a blanket, like below the waist a little bit. She's got a smear of blood on her upper left lip, and you can see where her hair is dragged through it because there's little trails through it onto her cheek. So we don't know if she's been assaulted or got into a fight earlier. We just don't know where that came from. I look at the body and I look at the scene, and having seen so many of them now, I think, okay, what makes me think this is not a homicide?
Richard Mastrin, the neighbor who called 911, says the victim is 30-year-old Solange Haikala.
This was a very sad case. Solange Haikala was a mother of a 12-year-old daughter. She died in this horrible way. And of course, as investigators, we want to give her justice. We want to find out who's responsible for her death, and we want to hold that person accountable.
While detectives continue their investigation of the studio, they are joined by the local coroner, Emma Hall.
The reason that I wanted to become coroner is when I was 4 years old, there was a woman who was murdered up the canyon a few miles from the ranch that I grew up on. That was really the first case that got me interested as a child, and I ended up becoming the coroner. That's the part that I really love about this field is it's very interesting work, and there's a lot of science. It's really about being there to make sure that justice can be served.
Coroners and law enforcement officers, when we go to a scene, we do separate but parallel investigations. So their focus is cause and manner of death and issuing the death certificate. Our focus is this a crime?
I remember she was laying on the floor, kind of wrapped in a blanket. So we are removing the blanket a little bit to where we can get a better look at her. And at that point, we realized that she's only wearing a tank top, but she didn't have anything on from the waist down.
Her daughter, Laura, tells us that she thought it was odd that her mother was found naked from the waist down. She said her mother normally always slept clothed.
The fact that she doesn't have anything on from the waist down is a red flag for sure.
She had bruises all over her body and on all what we call contact surfaces. So the shins, the legs, the forearms, the arms. At this point, I'm thinking this is a sex assault.
The night before, Solange asked her neighbor Richard to babysit her daughter Alora.
She was known to spend a lot of time partying with other residents of Jamestown.
The night before, she had gone to the Mercantile, which is pretty common for most of the people in town.
I know that there was times when Solange wanted to go out, she would drop Alora off at Rich's house, and Rich would take care of her, would feed her dinner, make sure she was bathed, and put her to bed.
Richard tells us about 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning, he hears Solange come home and speak with Alora.
And then she goes across the street into the studio, and Alora watches her go into the studio, turns the light on, and lays down on the couch, which you can see from Richie's house.
So far, that's our last sighting. We know she's alive at that time, and that after that, we don't know what happens to her.
To find out that she had been murdered, that somebody had caused this death. And, you know, it wasn't just the murder, she was all I could think of was, it just felt so unreal that she was gone. She's gone, my best friend is gone. And I didn't get to say goodbye.
One step that will help detectives find the killer is determining the exact time of death.
The longer the person has been deceased and the blood is not circulating through the body, it becomes fixed. And what that means is when you press on it, it stays red. Another observation we're looking for in the body is called rigor. So we'll be looking to see, can we move the fingers and the hands? Can we move the jaw? And then the other thing that we check is the core temperature of the body. With Solange, we felt that she had been there anywhere from 3 to 6 hours.
With a window for the murder established, investigators move on to determining how Solange died.
Although there were bruises on the body, there was no obvious sign where you can say, this is how she died without an autopsy. So we needed the pathologist to answer that basic question, how did this woman die?
To get the answers they need, detectives turn to forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Arnall. He's performed over 4,000 autopsies and offered testimony in more than 400 homicide trials.
It's my job as a forensic pathologist to defeat the assailant, to decipher what they've done despite their best efforts to fool you. I don't like bullies. And an assailant is in no uncertain terms a bully.
To assess how Solange died, Dr. Arnall and Coroner Hall begin with a detailed inventory of her body.
Part of that external examination includes the sex crimes kit. You need to take your swabs first or you may lose all that. It's called transient evidence.
We do innumerable swabs looking for DNA so that the detectives can identify who they have to talk to. We do pubic hair combings to see if someone would have left their pubic hair on this person.
They also take samples of the multiple bruises found all over Solange's body.
I swab those bruises for DNA. The thought being, if we identify your DNA on a breast bruise on a dead woman, you have some splaining to do. We look at the wrists because individuals try to protect themselves and assailants will attempt to control an individual by grabbing the wrists. So there are bruises on the wrists. What we saw were punctate, small round contusions. And in particular on the inner thigh and on the arm, there are linear arrays of 4 punctate contusions. Well, that sure looks like the fingertips of a hand. And on the inside of the thigh, there's no way a young woman's going to get an injury like that on the inside of a thigh unless someone was trying to pry her legs apart. There are a series of small round punctate bruises on the breasts, certainly suggestive of someone using their fingers to press or grab hard enough to break blood vessels. That's extraordinarily unusual for a young woman. Next, the bruises on the neck show up.
The bruises on Solange's neck are very important. We need to have some type of an idea from the pathologist the time those bruises occurred.
When you get a bruise, it starts out red. Over time, it changes to green. Then the bruise becomes yellow. Finally, it becomes brown, and then it fades away. And we're able to determine whether a bruise was created on the day of death or several days prior to death.
But the science of timing bruises can only provide a certain level of accuracy.
2 bruises could be a day apart, and I couldn't tell the difference. But in this case, they all appeared as though they could be contemporaneous.
However she was killed, it was a brutal confrontation. Police begin to investigate Solange's love life.
Sheldon Jones was Solange's boyfriend. They had been together for a number of years. When investigators started asking questions about her relationship with Sheldon, they started to hear a lot of troubling aspects. We heard from neighbors that there was always a lot of yelling. We heard that she would often appear with bruises and discoloration.
We knew that Laura was staying with Richard for the past several months, most every night, due to the fact that there was so much domestic abuse between Sheldon and Solange. Laura didn't feel safe there. Laura was sleeping on the couch in the living area, which is directly across from Solange's residence. It's an unobstructed view. Laura would wait up for her mother to come home every night, and her mother would normally come in, kiss her goodnight, and then go into the home across the way. Laura would watch her mother go in, make sure she gets in the house. Laura was taking care of her mom.
If you find out it's an abusive relationship, then you already know that the spouse or the boyfriend has a propensity for violence. You have to look at him as a very viable, certainly person of interest, maybe even a suspect.
One of our big concerns was that Sheldon was not home on the night into the morning when she was found. And Laura told us that he is normally always home. What changed his normal patterns and why?
Of course, that's the first person you're going to look at. But we can't find him.
Detectives investigating the suspicious death of Solange Heikkila have identified a prime suspect.
My initial assignment was to locate and interview Solange's boyfriend, Sheldon Jones. Where was he during the time frame of the last day to the last 2 days.
Solange knew Sheldon from high school. And back then he was a scrawny little blonde kid. He had moved away, and when he came back into her life, he changed from the scrawny kid to this, attractive man, and I think she was pretty smitten with him. But over time, it started becoming kind of tumultuous, the relationship. There was an aspect to Solange where it's like she almost seeked out those dangerous situations.
We learned that Solange was seeing and dealing with other men in town, and we knew that was an issue with Sheldon. We knew that he was jealous about her.
They fight all the time, they drink all the time. He's jealous of her, flirting with other guys. There's everything that would indicate Sheldon is the guy that did it.
Investigators track down Sheldon and bring him into the sheriff's office for questioning.
My first impression of Sheldon was he appeared to be distraught. He had just lost his significant other.
He's crying, he's confused. He seems genuinely upset.
Sheldon described Solange as being abusive to him, but he also said that he was abusive to her.
That Thursday night, they were drinking, and he pushed her away, he hit her, he said he twisted her breasts and did all of these things to her. He said, well, I did it because she wouldn't leave me alone, and he said, so I grabbed both of them and I twisted as hard as I could. Sheldon admitted he had assaulted Solange.
The mysterious bruises on Solange's breasts are accounted for. Police wonder what else Sheldon can explain.
Oftentimes in relationships that are abusive and violent, we see an escalation process. The pushing, the shoving, the psychological abuse can then lead into more serious kinds of violence. Eventually, in some tragic cases, that can also lead into murder.
One recent episode between Sheldon and Solange is alarming to investigators.
Sheldon described an incident that occurred about a week prior, where he put his hands on her neck in an assault. He put her down on the ground and began applying pressure. He thought that he probably obstructed her airways as well.
Sheldon's abuse of Solange is extreme. Dr. Arnall examines the bruises on her neck more closely to see how they fit with Sheldon's testimony.
We look at the neck with the skin removed. In this case, there were bruises over the thyroid gland on the left and right. There were bruises on the muscles of the neck. There was a bruise behind the voice box on the esophagus, meaning that someone had pressed so forcefully that it caused the thyroid cartilage to bruise the esophagus behind the voice box. In addition, I had the petechiae, a little burst blood vessels in the whites of the eyes. Petechiae are caused when the blood vessels of the neck are compressed. So there's no question this person died as a result of blunt trauma to the neck.
If Sheldon choked Solange once, he may have done it again. But facing a murder charge, Sheldon insists he was not there the night she was killed.
At about 6 o'clock the night before, when by all reports Solange was still alive, Sheldon had called Richie just to say, I'm not coming home tonight, let Solange know. We learned from both Sheldon and Richie that he was going to go to a friend's house and he was going to stay with his friend because he had to be back at work early the next morning.
This was verified by not only the co-worker, because that's not really a tight alibi, but by neighbors of the co-worker who said, yeah, we saw him here that night and he never left.
So Sheldon first comes across as a pretty good and likely suspect, but he had an alibi.
Detectives remain suspicious but need to see who else was involved with Solange.
So that's when the police really have to kind of go back to the drawing board and start talking to everybody who had anything to do with Solange the night before when she was seen alive.
You're working this and going, oh, we know who did it, we know who did it, we know who did it. Nope, it's not him. I had a bad feeling about the case because we have whole world possibilities. Somebody is out there that killed her. We don't know his motives, we don't know what he looks like, we don't know anything.
Detectives turn to Solange's daughter, Alora, for more details.
Well, Laura spoke about the light on in the artist studio where her mother was staying. She remembered her mother walking back and going into the artist studio, turning on the light, and being in that room. And she later recalls that the light was off, which she described to us as being unusual. She normally knew her mother would sleep with the light on. I thought with that light being off and that was such a concern to Laura that it was an important piece of information that we needed to look at fairly seriously.
She said then at 5 o'clock, the light was off. What that can mean is that whoever killed her had made entry between 4 and 5 o'clock and had turned the light off.
Solange's neighbor Rich also tells detectives that earlier that night, Solange had gone to a party at the home of a man named Kent Weeks.
I think there's a party at Kent's house just about every weekend. It certainly is possible that somebody could have followed her home from the party.
The news makes nearly everyone at the party a potential suspect. Detectives question the other guests and learn that a man named Robbie Kohler was seen driving Solange home.
Now the focus turns on Robbie. So what's Robbie's story? Robbie Kohler at that time was the fire chief in the town of Jamestown.
Robbie was on call when the call came out for Solange's body being found, but he didn't respond to the scene. That was somewhat unusual for Robbie. So I needed to talk to Robbie and determine where he was during this time frame. His demeanor to me at first was extremely nervous. He appeared that he didn't want to be talking about this incident. But I was able to learn that he had left the party around 12:30 from Kent's place. He's the one that drove Solange home, dropped her off in front of her residence around 2:30 in the morning, and then he drove home. So we had a void of time between 12:30 until 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning that was concerning. So I started asking him questions specifically about details during that time frame.
Robbie says that he and Solange leave and they park in front of the fire station. But he was very, very evasive. He said they were just making out, and then he said he fondled and licked her breasts, and he said that went on for probably a couple of hours.
So here's a guy who, in his very first telling of the story, leaves out the fact that he was with her in any kind of intimate way. You know, at first he said there was no touching. Later he admitted to some touching and fondling. Later he admitted to more touching and fondling. We want to know why the last person who was seen with her was not necessarily telling us the full truth.
Detectives interrogate Fire Chief Robbie Kohler about his connection to the murder of Solange Heikkila.
I knew he was hiding something. I just didn't know what.
In his autopsy report, Dr. Arnall details the evidence of sexual assault that detectives can use to investigate Robbie.
Now we see the bruises on the breast, bruises on the inner thigh, bruises on the arms. Our level of suspicion at this point is extraordinarily high. As it turns out, in this case, there was a small fissure in the vagina, indicating that this person had an intimate physical encounter that they didn't want. In the case of a there may be semen on a woman's clothing. That semen can be tested for DNA.
The clothing was collected and there was semen found on her tank top.
With this new information, detectives confront Robbie.
The detectives love going back to a perpetrator, knowing what happened. They get to play with a perpetrator as a cat plays with a mouse. And it's my job as a forensic pathologist to give that advantage to the detective. That's how we work as a team.
I know there's going to be some type of evidence on Solange's body. And where that DNA evidence is located on her body is going to be important. So when I approached Robbie about this, I explained to him that he needed to be very clear and specific about how he answers these questions.
So this is where Mark's very good. He says, well, why don't you tell me, man? Just, man to man, why don't you tell me what's going on?
But despite detectives' attempts at getting Robbie to confess, he insists he did not have sex with her and that he is not guilty of murder.
We think his DNA is going to be found on her neck, on her breast certainly, but if there's any vaginal DNA and it's him, he has some explaining to do because he never went there, he says.
But with the pressure mounting, Robbie tells investigators there is another man they should be questioning.
So Robbie Kohler says just prior to leaving, there was a man named Tom A. asking Solange if he could drive her home, and it was clear to Robbie that Solange did not want to go home with Tom A. So Robbie says when they stopped in front of the firehouse and they parked, Tom A. kept driving back and forth. What was he doing driving back and forth on the street that night? At this point, we have two interesting people. We have the last person who was actually with her, Robbie Kohler, who was with her parked in a car. And then we had this particular person, Tom A, is out there. He's driving by, he's watching them, and ultimately engages them in a short conversation.
He pulls in next to Robbie's truck and says, hey, are you guys okay? He goes, yeah. And he says he leaves and goes west, and he doesn't see him come back.
Despite the story, Robbie still has no alibi.
We couldn't corroborate where Robbie was during the night after and into the morning of the day that Solange was found. He said he was home, but we have no one else there that could corroborate that story.
So he's kind of in limbo. He's not in custody, but he's certainly somebody that we need to keep an eye on.
Detectives now turn their focus to this other man, Thomas A., and question local residents about him.
So all we know is he was like a strange guy, and not really a lot of people in Jamestown really liked him. Solange didn't want to be anywhere near him. And in fact, she confronted him in the Mercantile one night and said, what you did to me, I've heard you did to other women in this town. Now, nobody knows what that means.
Detectives take it as a sign about Tom A.'s character. They proceed with a background check and are startled by what they uncover.
Investigators look through the registry of sex offenders who are living in that particular area.
We checked the registered sex offender within the area of Jamestown, and we get a name of Thomas Altimus. He has a sexual assault in his criminal history. We needed to know him, and we need to find him soon.
Registered sex offender Thomas Altimus was one of the last people to see Solange Heikkila alive.
He had a sexual assault here in Colorado from 2006.
So we got the reports from his sex offense that got him the sex offender label, and it was a female who was very intoxicated, and it was a very violent sexual assault. Thomas Altimus had taken her home and had sexually assaulted her, and he had beat her up.
If Solange was drunk that night, she may have been an easy target for Altimus.
When we talked to Laura, one of the things that she said was she remembered her mom coming in the door, and she said she was drunker than she had ever seen her.
There was a definite attitude of like, I know what I'm doing, like this is okay, I'm just having fun. And then it became a habit.
To test Solange's alcohol levels at the time of her murder, Dr. Arnall runs a full toxicology analysis.
We measured blood alcohol, we measured urine alcohol, and we measured vitreous alcohol. Vitreous is the fluid in the eye. In this case, the vitreous and urine alcohols are significantly higher. What it means is that this person's blood alcohol, minutes or hours earlier, had been much higher. The blood alcohol is the alcohol that is actually bathing the brain and affecting this individual's behavior. In this particular case, it was probably over 0.3. She would have been stumbling drunk. She would have been significantly incapacitated.
Thomas Ultimus is now a prime suspect, and it's time for him to be questioned.
We finally go to his house, and we can't find him. There's no sign of him anywhere, but his truck is there. So he either hitched a ride somewhere or he's somewhere around.
So we talked to a good friend of Thomas Ultimus. He tells us that he had recently given Thomas a shotgun. And he said after this event happens, after Solange is found, he disappears. He says Thomas always talked about an interest for a piece of property that was for sale at the end of the road that Thomas lived on. We made a determination that we were going to go check that area. It's a hilly, forested area in the mountains. We knew that Thomas possibly had a shotgun. So there were 4 of us. 2 of us took our long guns. 2 of us had our pistols. We hiked up the trail area, and something catches my eye about 70 yards in front of me. At that time, I didn't know who it was or what it was. And we started a verbal command, show us your hands, show us your hands. We were coming up closer and closer. It appeared to be a man.
He's laying there on his side, snuggled up with a shotgun between his legs. He's dead of looks like a shotgun wound to the head.
At that time, we felt that it was possibly Thomas Ultimus. So we've called for additional resources, including the coroner's office and their investigative staff.
I hiked up the mountain with the detectives, and we did a body assessment there on the side of the mountain. With the shotgun wound, you know, there's quite an explosion, really, and there's pieces and parts for a bit of a distance. And so at that point, we're kind of, you know, looking around because you don't want to step in the wrong place, and you want to retrieve as much of that as possible. Really, the entire head is disrupted by that injury. And so there's not a lot to go on for a visual identification.
Dr. Arnall begins his second autopsy in 3 days.
There was no ability to look at this person and to determine who they were. Their face was gone. Because there's soot inside the tissue inside the wound. It appears to be contact, meaning that the metal of the barrel of the gun was touching the skin when the gun was discharged. We don't see evidence of a struggle. That individual had placed a shotgun underneath their chin and pulled the trigger.
We couldn't identify him through photographs, but we felt fairly confident that we should have an identification through fingerprints fairly soon through the coroner's office. And we did. He was identified as Thomas Ultimus.
Well, my opinion is that he shot himself because he didn't want to go back to prison. Once he realized the next morning that it really did happen, he goes home, gets a shotgun that he had borrowed, loads it with double-aught buckshot, and walks up the hillside.
Detective Ainsworth's theory about Thomas Ultimus is certainly possible, But with 2 other suspects intimately involved with Solange right before her death, detectives need proof.
Without the DNA, your ability to determine which individuals are responsible for what activity would have been severely compromised. In this case, no science, no case.
Two months have passed since Solange Heikkila was discovered dead in her studio. The swab results from various parts of her body are in. Investigators hope that DNA will prove who killed her.
We still have 3 outstanding suspects at this time, so we knew that the DNA was going to be important.
The first suspect is Solange's abusive boyfriend.
We found DNA samples from Sheldon on Solange, on her breast, around her facial area, and other bruises. We knew he had been in an intimate relationship with Solange, so we would anticipate and expect that his DNA would be on Solange's body.
So Sheldon Jones we've eliminated.
Next up is the Jamestown fire chief.
Robbie Kohler, we haven't eliminated, but he has fallen down on the list. Robbie Kohler's DNA was on her breast, which is where he said it would be. And Tom Altimus is at the top of the list.
Thomas Altimus's DNA was found on her neck, her wrist. It was inside her vagina. So that was strong information for us to believe that Thomas Altimus was with her prior to her death and was the one that killed her.
So there was a mixture of DNA, but really the most key one was the vaginal swabs, with that being only, coming back with Thomas.
Both Sheldon and Robbie can explain how their DNA ended up on Solange. The only possible explanation for Thomas Altimus is that he is the killer.
When I heard that Thomas Altimus's semen, the sperm fraction, was from him, it was like, okay, this is it. There we go.
Investigators finally have an answer to the mystery of who killed an innocent young mother.
I think what happened is Solange and Robbie drive down and they park in front of the fire station. And Altimus parks somewhere where he can watch what they're doing. And then sometime later, Robbie drives Solange off. Now remember, she's very, very intoxicated. Altimus had waited long enough for her to maybe pass out, go to sleep or whatever, but he knew where she was because the light was on. So I think he goes into the studio and attacks her and sexually assaults her and strangles her. And then leaves and goes back to his house.
I never really thought about the fact that she wouldn't be in my life anymore. She doesn't get to be here to watch her daughter grow up, her grandchild grow up. She doesn't get to be here to be my old best friend.
So now all that's left to do is write up what's called a probable cause summary. And it's basically if you're writing a warrant for the person, except the person's dead. And then we presented that to Ryan Brackley, and he said if he was still alive, we would definitely charge him.
So the case was ultimately cleared with death of an offender, with being Thomas Altimus.
It is not unusual for perpetrators to adjudicate the case by either hanging themselves or blowing their brains out. That's not uncommon.
The key to putting this whole thing together is the forensic science. You know, you have the background, you have all of that other stuff, you have his actions that day. None of it by itself is going to prove that he did this, but the forensic science does.
Without the DNA evidence, I think this case probably would have gone unsolved. I think we would have had a good understanding of what occurred, but I don't think we would have had specific evidence that would have been able to link Thomas Ultimus to this crime.
The DA closes the case on Solange's murder, but there's one last loose end that investigators need to tie up.
We wanted to do some justice for Solange, for her daughter, and for her family. So when we finished with the homicide investigation, we asked ourselves, should we focus and hold Sheldon Jones accountable for those injuries that were all over the body of Solange Heikkila? We filed charges against Sheldon Jones, and he eventually pleaded guilty to an assault charge.
I think it was important to me as just one last show of, we care about her. And I think it was to show him that you can't get away with this. Yeah, she's dead, but that doesn't mean that you walk on it.
After I go home, I do contemplate this issue of man's inhumanity to man. But you can only do that if you keep your wits about you. If you go through meticulously and do everything you were trained to do, then the case is going to be resolved as it should be.
What struck me about this case was Alora. I felt so bad for her. So she loses her mom and goes on with her life, and she's just, amazing is an overused word, but I think it's completely appropriate when you talk about her. She's an amazing young woman.